Good morning. Today's date is April 26th, 2007. My name is Richard Nicholas. Today I will be conducting an oral history interview with Harold Novick for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Harold.
Good morning.
Would you state your full name, please, and would you spell your last name?
Name is Harold Novick, N-O-V-I-C-K.
And where do you presently live, Harold?
I live in Richmond, Massachusetts, though my post office address is Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
And what is your date of birth and where were you born?
May 6th, 1922. I was born in the East Bronx, New York City.
Did you grow up and go to school in the Bronx?
I did. I started off in a public elementary school, kindergarten and first grade, and then I was transferred to what you would call a Jewish parochial school. It is called yeshiva, beginning in the second grade, and I was there from second to the eighth grade. They didn't have junior or high school or middle school at that time. And then from there, I went on to a Jewish parochial high school in Manhattan, Upper Manhattan, where I remained for approximately 2 years. And then due to illness at that time, which resulted in a lot of loss of weight, I was directed by my physician to leave that school because of the hours we had to put in. And I went to a public high school, Morris High School, in the Bronx, in the fifth grade, and I went through to the very end where when I graduated.
Another famous person went to Morris High.
Oh yes, General Colin Powell was a student there a few years after I was there, and he too graduated from Morris High School.
Can you tell us a little bit what life was like growing up at that time in the Bronx?
Well, I live in what you call a sort of a melting pot neighborhood. While each group had its own independence and imaginary fence around its community, I lived really in a neighborhood that included blacks, Irish, Italian, as well as members of the Jewish faith. And we experienced not only our own individual practices, but we were introduced to the cultures of other religions and other races as well. I learned when I was older that I was really living in a low-income neighborhood, and my family was a low-income family. But because of the rich family life I experienced and the rich neighborhood life and educational life that I experienced, I never realized or felt that I was deprived in any way.
Right. Did you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, I had two older brothers, one 3 years older and one 6 years older than me.
And were they veterans too?
Yeah, my oldest brother had graduated, had gotten a master's degree in social work, and was placed into a mental health unit that remained in the United States throughout his tour of duty. And my other brother, my middle brother, was a member of the intelligence department in Washington, D.C. He was great on languages, and he was in the process, interestingly enough, in learning Arabic at that time, in terms of whatever they had in mind for him.
Right. And what did your father do for a living?
My father was what I could consider to be an amateur metal worker in a metal junkyard. But he had an uncanny talent of identifying the nature of metal or the content of metals, even though he wasn't a professional metallurgist. But he did work for one employer for a period of 25 years. It was just interrupted for a brief period of time, a few years during the war years, where when he went to work for the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Right. And your father was an immigrant as well as your mother?
Yeah, my father was born in Belarusia. Actually came here during the Russo-Jap War, 1904-1905. He escaped from Russia through Manchuria and China and came in through the West Coast. My mother was born in Poland.
Very interesting. And what year did you finally graduate from high school, Harold?
That was in 1940.
And did you continue your education at this time?
Yes, except that I felt that I needed to go to work. I wanted to have experience of work. I also wanted to contribute to my own family. They never asked me to, but it was a personal desire on my part, so I decided to go to work during the day and go to City College at night. I had to work till about 6 o'clock in my first job, and I practically ran from lower Manhattan via the subway to my classroom, City College up at 137th Street and Convent Avenue in Manhattan.
I see. And were you in ROTC at this time?
Not at this time. When I switched a year later, I went to night school for 1 year, and then I saw the handwriting on the wall in terms of the war, and decided to get as much education as I possibly could, transferred to the day, and at that time I entered the ROTC.
Did you remain with it?
No, I determined that it wasn't to my liking or wasn't in keeping with my talents and skills, and dropped out after a term.
Now, you mentioned that the war was imminent, and then it finally happened. Around this time, did you enlist in the Army?
Yes, in October of 1942, I enlisted in the Army, and at that time, the Army decided that because I was majoring in psychology and sociology, they had in mind the idea of training me to do personnel work. They decided to keep me in college for that at least for that particular year.
Mm-hmm. And how long did you remain at City College?
I remained until June of '43. At that time, I guess I was beginning my junior year in college. At that time, they decided to take all those who are on inactive duty into active duty. And it so happened that it was prior to the time when they had hoped I would be entering into another training program for the personnel work. They took me in, let's say, prematurely in relationship to that plan. And they asked me if I would be interested in engineering, because they had a spot for me to be trained as an engineer, and I told them that I was not interested in that. It wasn't in keeping with my career goals. And so they decided to, they decided later after the initial orientation period to assign me to medical basic training.
I see. And what were your dates of service?
It was from June of '43 to April of 1946.
I see. And where did you go for basic training, Harold?
After 3 weeks at Camp Upton on Long Island, which is the orientation period where they do all kinds of testing and introduce you to Army life, which is highlighted by KP duty. I was sent to Camp Grant, Illinois, which was located in Rockford, Illinois, about 90 miles northwest of Chicago, for medical basic training.
Mm-hmm. And was it hard for you to adjust to military life?
I could say yes and no, but what I found out about myself that whenever I faced something of an unusual nature, rather than becoming depressed over it or succumbing to the differences that were reflected in that activity, I was always challenged by it. So on that basis, being challenged and wanting to measure up to that challenge made it easier for me to accept the adjustment that Army experience represented for me.
Mm-hmm. And what types of training now did you receive at Camp Grant?
Well, we went through the usual drilling that goes with basic training, and obstacle courses and hiking, and learning how to survive under battle conditions. But in addition to that, we took numerous biology and anatomy courses, and also some practical work in terms of taking blood pressure, pulse, temperature, drawing blood, and things of that sort.
Basic medical procedures?
Yeah, basic medical procedures, first aid.
Mm-hmm. And how long was this aspect of your training?
It was about 3 months, and very, very intensive, where you're involved from morning to night in some form of activity.
And where did you go next?
From there, I was assigned to Lawson General Hospital Technician School, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And I was assigned to take a surgical technician's course to become a surgical technician.
This was advanced training?
No, I was first assigned to take a basic course as a surgical technician, and subsequently they decided to hold me over to take an advanced surgical technician's course, and then they decided to hold me over with one other individual to teach operating room procedure.
I see. Now, there was a shortage of medical personnel in Atlanta at this time, wasn't there?
That is correct. Grady Hospital, which was a hospital that was available primarily for low-income families, had a shortage of medical personnel because so many had been assigned to the armed forces that entered the service. And they asked the hospital to provide additional help. And at that time, as an instructor in the operating room, I was asked to, not asked, but I was assigned to work at Grady Hospital, where I worked in the black operating room, and then the white operating room, and black emergency room, and white emergency room. There was that division at that time.
And you mentioned off camera that you were struck by this discrimination. You hadn't experienced it before?
Yes, having, as I said earlier, been born into a melting pot neighborhood, and having learned to appreciate and respect cultural as well as religious and other kinds of differences, it was difficult for me to accept the level of discrimination that existed in the South at that time. What I learned, of course, in books came home in terms of reality.
I see.
And the difference between theory and practice was most prominent at that time, and it was difficult to see people being treated differently, not only in terms of the operating room and the emergency room, but also on when I traveled on buses or other public transportation, and blacks were ushered into the back, and others were allowed to sit in the front or in the middle of the bus.
I see. Now, you mentioned you had an unusual experience while working at Grady Hospital.
Yes, when I was assigned to the white emergency room, the ambulance service was part of their functioning. And one time I was the medical person, so-called, assigned to respond to emergencies, and I was called this one time to a home where a woman was about to give birth. The idea was to deliver her to the hospital. When I came there, she was, based on the training I received, I knew that giving birth was imminent, and therefore I was in touch with the hospital. And anyway, the bottom line was I was called upon to deliver the baby before I could bring her to the hospital. That was both scary and an unusual experience.
I can imagine.
I'm glad that the training I received and whatever strength I had measured up to the occasion.
Now, after you finished your training in Atlanta, where did you go?
After that, I was sent back. I guess I would have remained there, but in retrospect, I think that the invasion of Europe was imminent and in the process of being implemented, and it called for every able-bodied person to be assigned to outfits going overseas. And I was sent back to Camp Grant, Illinois, in Rockford, Illinois, in order to be assigned. And the idea was to be assigned to a hospital that was destined to go overseas. So I was sent back to Camp Grant, Illinois.
Now, you received more training here, is that correct?
Well, the training I had received previously led to my being assigned to the operating room of a model hospital that had been set up for demonstration purposes. And I was assigned to the operating room to interpret operating room procedures, to interpret the various kinds of equipment that existed in the operating room. And I was there to demonstrate the medical practices of that period to notables that were going through the hospital on a regular basis.
And at this time, you had about 14 months of training, intense training.
That is correct. A very intensive training, I might add.
Did you have a title at this time, or were you going to get a title at this time?
Well, my title was surgical technician. Once I was assigned to a hospital, I became an operating room technician. So you could say a surgical technician assigned to the operating room.
I see. And you did receive an assignment to a unit going overseas at this time?
I was assigned to the 168th General Hospital.
And when was that, Harold?
That was in August of '44.
Now, can you explain to us how large an outfit this 168th General Hospital was?
I'd say, I don't recall the exact number, but I would say anywhere from 150 to 200 people were employed in one capacity or another, both from a professional point of view as well as from the technical point of view that helps to all the support services that are necessary in order to translate a hospital into a functioning unit.
Now, as an operating room technician, what were your particular duties?
Well, to begin with, it meant that all of the equipment, any kinds of equipment that was used in the operating room had to be sterilized, whether it be the instruments themselves or the gowns, the blankets or sheets, whatever was used within the operating room had to be sterilized, so that we were in charge of seeing to it that they were properly sterilized. In addition to that, we needed to learn the kinds of instruments that needed to be used in each of the operations that might occur with the operating room. We were also required to learn of the special requirements of certain surgeons. Some surgeons were particularly interested in using some special instruments. We needed to be aware of that so that whatever was needed in an operating or in relationship to an operation had to be present for use during the operation.
I see.
And then there were times when, due to shortages of nurses, regular nurses, we were also called upon to assist the surgeon in terms of handing the necessary required instruments to him, and also overseeing the process by which each instrument given had to be returned,
Right.
So that they were not left in the person being operated on.
Right.
And then also cleanup after the operation. And there were times under war conditions where we were even called upon to do a little suturing.
I see. And when did you leave for Europe?
It was in September of 1946. 44, I'm sorry, my apologies. September of 1944.
And you left on a particular ship.
Yep, we left on the Queen Mary. Interestingly enough, in 1939, I had said goodbye to a cousin of mine and an aunt who were, it was August of 39. The cousin was visiting with us from Lithuania. My aunt, of course, lived with us. That was my so-called second mother for as long as I was in my growing years. And my aunt was going back to Lithuania and Poland to visit with her relatives, and my cousin was going back to say goodbye to her parents prior to going to Palestine at that time with her fiancé. And that was in August of '39, and they went on the Queen Mary. As you well know, the war broke out in September of '39. My cousin couldn't come back because she was a citizen of Lithuania, but my aunt, as a naturalized citizen, did return via Italy. And there, and I was reminded of that in September of '44, when I found myself on the Queen Mary going abroad.
Interesting. Now, there was a famous person on board too, is that right?
Oh yes, Winston Churchill. He was returning from one of his famous conferences with President Roosevelt and Stalin. As you know, they had periodic conferences, and he was returning from one of them and was on the ship.
And what happened when you arrived? Well, you told me it was in Scotland.
We arrived at the Firth of Clyde outside of Glasgow in Scotland, and of course Winston Churchill, before he left the ship, spoke to all of the members of the armed services representing a variety of units and functions, and then we were able to witness as going off the ship, where he turned to all of us and gave us the famous V sign.
Very good. Going back to your time on board ship, was there any entertainment on the way over?
Yes, the 168th General Hospital did have a special services unit, and primarily their role was for entertainment purposes, even though they might have had other functions within the hospital. And the head of this particular unit turned to me once and said he wanted to have an evening of entertainment, and asked me to become the master of ceremonies. Of course, we had a band, and he wanted the master of ceremonies to not only introduce the songs that the band were to play, but also to serve as a comedian as in the role of MC. And now, with tongue in cheek, I decided to take on the responsibility. And I was able to, I guess, use my sense of humor and my knowledge of a lot of folk songs to see my way through successfully in that role.
Had you had any experience in this before?
No, not at all. I guess the only experience I could recall that might be comparable to getting up in front of a large audience was the fact that when I was at Morris High School, someone dared me in my senior year to run for office, and I ran for vice president of the Morris High School organization and got in, but one of the requirements at that time was to give speeches. This is speeches in order to encourage people to vote for me at that time. And Morris High School was a very large organization. It, in its main building, had a morning session, afternoon session, and they had 3 annexes, and it required me to go to all of these units and give speeches. So I would say that that's the only time I had the experience of getting up in front of large audiences and being a focal point of attention.
Now, you were made an honorary member of this unit, is that correct?
Yep. As a result of, I did it twice on the ship. And as a result of that, they made me an honorary member. And that meant that when this particular Special Services unit entertained the physicians, the other officers and nurses, etc., I was allowed to be in attendance with them, even though I didn't have any particular function at that time.
I see. Now, you mentioned you landed at the Firth of Clyde in Scotland. Did you stay there long?
No, we immediately boarded a train heading towards Southampton.
In England?
In England, yes.
And you mentioned you made a stop.
We stopped in Manchester. Actually, it was in the middle of the night at that time. And the thing I remember about that experience is that members of the British Red Cross was there, and they served us what I thought was coffee, because it had cream in it. It turned out to be tea. I didn't realize that the English had their tea with milk, and I had never experienced that. But that was my introduction to the culture of England and Great Britain.
Now, when you got to Southampton, did you just stay there long?
No, we didn't stay there either. We boarded Liberty ships with the idea of crossing the Channel to France. And we did cross the Channel, and then as we approached Utah Beach, we were transferred to the LST ships, or whatever you call them, and we landed on Utah Beach via those LSTs.
And do you remember when that was?
That was in September of 1944.
Now, your arrival was timed with something too, wasn't it? The setting up of the tent hospital.
Oh yes. Well, obviously, our hospital was destined to be the first hospital set up in Normandy following the invasion. But prior to our getting there, they had to clear the area, and they had to set up a tent hospital with all the necessary equipment in order to enable us to function. So when we arrived at Utah Beach, we had to climb up a hill, because there was a big hill overlooking Utah Beach, and transferred to Army trucks, and then transferred to the hospital.
What were your thoughts, Harold, while climbing up that hill?
Well, the immediate thought was I imagined how terrible it was for the soldiers who were involved in the initial onslaught. Terrible for them to be on those beaches with German personnel on top of that hill shooting down on them. you just couldn't help feel for them and respect the challenge that they faced during those initial days.
Now you boarded trucks, you said, and they took you to your hospital. Now, where was that located?
That was located near the town of St. Lo.
And can you describe your impression of St. Lo at that time?
Well, St. Lo was what I consider to be a sort of a ghost town. I walked through it more than once, and there wasn't a building that wasn't damaged by either the air or on the ground. You just couldn't help but respect the kind of damage that was associated with the bombing as a way of clearing the area or defeating the enemy at that time. It left a lasting impression on me in terms of what a war can do to a city.
Now, can you describe the hospital?
Well, the hospital is really a tent hospital. If you've experienced a program of MASH, it comes as close as you possibly can to understand what the structure of the hospital looked like. We lived in tents, slept in tents, ate in tents, and functioned as, well, in my case, functioned as an operating room technician, a surgical technician in tents.
And you said you were impressed by the degree of organization.
Oh yes, it was amazing to see a hospital built from scratch in a relatively short period of time, and we were never at a loss for whatever we needed in order to carry out our function in a responsible and effective way.
And what were your duties here now at this?
My duty was as an operating room technician. Once I was assigned to the 168th General Hospital, I never served or functioned in any other way except as an operating room technician during the duties I alluded to earlier.
And the war was going full bore at this time, is that right?
Oh yeah, it continued, even though it didn't continue in our area. The front moved towards the German border, also Alsace-Lorraine, Metz and Nancy. So the front was beyond Paris and moving closer to the German border.
Now, you mentioned that your memories were vague while at this because of the routine day in, day out.
That's correct. Every day, every moment seemed the same. It all blended together because we were constantly at work at dealing with the wounded and trying to do all we possibly can to save them or stabilize them or return them to normal functioning.
Now, these were large amounts of wounded, is that correct?
Oh yes, I couldn't count. I'd say at least 1,000 and more were served in that tent hospital.
Right. How did you learn to handle the emotional stress, Harold?
That's an interesting question. I can't say I learned it. I didn't know that I could do it until I did it, or until I was faced with it and realized the degree to which whatever contributed to my upbringing or education or personality lent itself towards my being able to focus attention on what I was doing and why I was doing it, rather than on the effects of it.
I see.
I just didn't allow. I felt it, but I concentrated on what I can do to help the situation, rather than to allow myself to be affected by it.
I see. Now, you said you had one particularly vivid memory of your time here at the hospital.
Yes, it's a memory that remained with me to this day. Apart from the memory of what war can do to people and what that particular war did to a lot of people, whether or not they were in the armed services or as civilians. A member of the 101st Airborne was, after completing his tour of duty, was returning home or in the process of going home and stepped on a mine in Normandy that hadn't been cleared. And the lower part of his body was practically blown away and was brought into the hospital. And all they can do is to stabilize the situation as best they can, but they didn't give much hope to his being able to survive. This happened at night when I was on duty, and I stayed with him throughout the night, holding his hand, and he was in the position of being able to converse or to talk to me, but somehow I had hoped that by being next to him and by holding his hand during that particular period of time, that somehow I was communicating a feeling of compassion to him. And he passed away about somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning.
Well, I'm sure you made it easier for him.
Yeah.
Also, while you were in Normandy, you had occasion to see the cemetery from the landing?
Yes. A cousin of mine was also in the service. He was in battle in Sicily and in Italy. And he communicated with me at some point. The mother of a friend of his had been in touch with him. This friend had been killed during the Normandy invasion and was buried in a cemetery set up in Normandy. And the cousin asked if I could take a picture of the grave so that it could be sent to the mother. This was a special request on her part. And I was able to get the time to go to that cemetery and take a picture of that grave to send to them.
That's good. Now, what were your impressions of that place?
Well, I said earlier when we landed at Utah Beach and going up the hill, I imagined what it was like, or tried to imagine what it was like to the initial invading force when the Germans were shooting down on them. When I saw the extent of people buried in that cemetery, it brought home to me, more so than ever before, as to what it must have been like and how many people perished as a result of that initial invasion. The crosses, the Jewish Stars of David that I witnessed at that cemetery was enormous and certainly brought home to me what war is all about, apart from my experiences in the operating room.
Now, as the war progressed, did your hospital move too?
Yes, when the battles moved towards Germany, it was just decided that we ought to move the hospital too, and that was the time when we were moved from where we were in Normandy to Metz, France, which was located in Alsace-Lorraine.
Now, before your move, you were treating German prisoners too?
Well, obviously we were called upon to treat both our own as well as those members of the German army that were wounded. And increasingly, of course, as the war front moved towards Germany, there was less of a need to service our own personnel in the hospital, and increasingly German personnel were brought in to the hospital for treatment, and German doctors were also, who were prisoners of war, were called upon to treat their own. I guess the decision was finally made to, under American leadership and oversight, to transfer the operation of the hospital to German personnel to treat their own wounded who were prisoners of war. And the chief anesthetist in my unit, the chief anesthetist, was called upon to train the physicians, and I was called upon to train the non-com personnel who were assigned to the operating room, so that they could take over the operation and use American standards of operation to serve their own.
I see. Well, I didn't ask you this here, but what was your rank at this time?
I was called a T5, technical 5th grade.
I see. Now, also at this time, at this hospital, you were treating SS troops too?
Oh yeah, whoever was captured, whether they were SS people or members of the armed forces, or they served in another capacity on behalf of the Third Reich, if they were wounded or they were sick, they were brought into the hospital.
And you said you had some mixed emotions about this part of it.
Well, increasingly I learned about what the Germans were doing to members of the Jewish faith, and their attitudes, of course, towards them. And it made it for a great difficulty for me to witness someone who represented that kind of cruelty to others, regardless of the religion or race. And it's something that I had to discipline myself against because I represented the U.S. government and I represented the U.S. Army, and it had a certain standard to uphold in terms of treating people regardless of their past practice.
Well,
and I guess in a way I was fortunate on behalf of the Army to be able to be disciplined enough to uphold the standards that were supposed to be practiced at that time.
Well, that's to your credit. But there were lighter moments here too. You mentioned a brief furlough you had?
Well, that furlough really actually came later, after the war ended. If you want me to allude to it now.
I'm referring to the Paris.
Yeah. The Paris part. Okay. Yes, you're absolutely correct. On the way to Metz, we stopped at Chartres. I didn't call it. The reason I responded the way I did, I didn't call it a furlough. We stopped at Chartres for a few days of rest before going on to Metz, and I was invited by a couple of other members of the unit who had been able to get a hold of a Jeep, and we were near Paris. So the idea was, if we were to see Paris and experience it, we had to do it overnight. So early in the evening, we drove via Jeep into Paris and happened to be there all night long and came back in time for revelry the next morning. And so I was able to experience the kind of thoughts and the kind of feelings associated with Paris.
Exciting.
At that time.
And you got to see the Folies Bergère?
Got to see that too. That was another maturing experience on my part,
sure.
you might say.
Now, when you went back to Metz, there was some serious fighting going on in the area. Is that correct?
Yes. First of all, there was a lot of fighting going on around Nancy that and we served the wounded of that battle. But while we were in Metz, the Battle of the Bulge also broke out, and then subsequently, of course, there was the actual invasion of Germany, and we served the wounded from all those battles.
And you lost some people from your unit because of the Bulge.
Yeah, at some point there was a call for all personnel that could be spared to be sent to the Battle of the Bulge front to be available if needed and necessary. Mm-hmm. So all the people that could be spared from the hospital were sent, and those that couldn't be spared, of course, remained.
And because of this, I would assume hospital activity increased during this time?
It did, and of course, because of the number of personnel that left, our involvement of the operating room was much more intense. But nevertheless, that was the name of the game at that time.
And you got the job done.
You did what you had to do, and you had to do it in the best way possible.
Now, did you stay in Metz for the duration of the war?
Yeah, we actually stayed until Germany gave in, mm-hmm. and at that particular time, the Japanese, or the war with Japan was still going on, and because of the reputation of the 168th General Hospital, we were assigned to be transferred to the Pacific theater of war. And so at the end of the war with Germany, we were then sent, or we were on our way to the Japanese theater of war.
And where were you heading for in France?
We were heading towards Marseille to board ships and be taken to the Japanese theater.
Mm-hmm. But while there, the war with Japan ended?
While we were in Reims, we stopped at Reims for a resting period, and that's when the atom bombs were sent down on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. And subsequently, as you well know, the Japanese war ended, and that then it became unnecessary for us to move in that direction.
So your unit was rerouted at this time?
We were rerouted to Antwerp. Both wars had ended, and of course there were a large number of American troops still in Germany, and they were destined to be there for a long period of time before being transferred home. So there was still a need for the medical and surgical services that our hospital was in a position to provide. So we were transferred to Antwerp and set up a hospital and then an operation there.
This was no longer a tent hospital, though, is that
No,
correct?
it was set up in a building, actual brick and stone building.
Now, you received a furlough while at Antwerp, is that correct?
That's correct. That's what I thought you were alluding to before. Yeah, I had the opportunity this time to go to Edinburgh and to London, and to also Amsterdam, Holland.
And you said you met a family there that was...
Well, when I went to Amsterdam, I was assigned to somehow the Army worked it out for me. I was assigned to stay with a Dutch family in Amsterdam, mm-hmm. and to learn from them what it was like during the period of occupation, and particularly what it was like towards members of the Jewish faith.
I see. Now, at this time, did you learn of an opportunity to continue your education?
When I was in Antwerp, yes, the Army made it known that for those who had plans to return to school or to go to school following the release from armed forces, they gave them the opportunity of attending school at Oxford, Cambridge, and Biarritz American University. I was told that if I went to Oxford and Cambridge, that were willing to accept me, that I would have to return to my outfit. If I went to Biarritz American University, following successful completion of the studies there, I would be sent directly to Le Havre, put on the ship, and sent home. So obviously I chose at that time to go to Biarritz American University.
And what type of studies were those at Biarritz?
I took several courses in sociology at that time. And I experienced, I subsequently got credit for those courses at City College when I returned.
Now, upon your completion, you said you went to Le Havre. Is that where you boarded ship to come home?
Was sent directly to Le Havre and put on a Liberty ship and sent home.
And where did you go when you arrived back in the States?
When I arrived back home, sent to Fort Dix, and I was released from service at Fort Dix.
And when was that, Harold?
That was in April of 1946.
Now, do you recall the day that you returned to your home in the Bronx?
Sure did. I remember not only coming in by train into Grand Central Station, and actually no, it was Penn Station, I'm sorry, and then getting on the subway, going home, and then walking down Morris Avenue where I lived, and as I approached the apartment house that my folks were living in, there was my aunt and mother hanging out the third floor window, waiting to greet me.
That must have been quite a feeling.
It was quite a feeling. After being away for, well, I guess approximately 2.5 years, because I'd gone home on a furlough when I was in Atlanta, Georgia, to attend my brother's wedding, my middle brother's wedding. And that was the last time I saw members of my family until I was walking down that street.
Well, it must have been just as nice for your family.
It was very nice, and it was especially nice because it was on the eve of Passover, holiday of Passover, and that very meaningful family holiday where entire families get together for a special meal, as known as the Seder, to celebrate the Passover and the historical release from slavery in ancient Egypt. Mm-hmm. And coming home at that particular time had special meaning, even more special than ordinarily would have been the case.
Right. Now, was it hard for you to adjust back, get into the swing of things and back to civilian life?
No, again, I guess it could have been hard. I certainly felt a tremendous difference between being away for 3 years with all the experiences I had and then coming back to normal living. But again, my attitude, philosophy was to focus attention not on the difference, but focus attention on how to get back to normalcy. So I immediately applied to City College to return and continue with my studies. I was immediately, of course, accepted, even given a lot of credit for the work I did in the service. For example, I was given credit for a year of speech because I was a teacher, a year of biology because of the area I functioned in, and even given credit for physical training. And that enabled me to complete my studies at City College that much faster.
And did you complete your studies there?
I did indeed. In January of, let's see, that would be January of 1947.
And what did you earn a degree?
I earned a degree of science in social science, Bachelor of Science in Social Science.
Now, did you take advantage of the GI Bill to continue
Yes.
your education?
It didn't cost the government too much initially when I was going to undergraduate school at City College, because at that time, if you had the high school average, you are able to attend City College tuition free. But the GI Bill did cover all of the books and the other miscellaneous expenses associated with going to school.
But you continued your education further, is that right?
I did. I continued. I chose to enter the social work field and applied to Columbia University School of Social Work to pursue a master's degree in social work. Interestingly enough, when I started my work at Columbia, lo and behold, I found that General Eisenhower was the president of the university. And I thought to myself, as I think now, that we couldn't get away from each other. And his signature is on my degree.
After you finished your education, I know you had an outstanding career. Could you just fill us in briefly on the highlights?
Highlights of what?
Of your career after you finished your education?
After I graduated from Columbia University, I had trained initially in two different agencies. One was a family service agency doing family counseling, parent-child counseling, marital counseling, and individual counseling. And then my second year of training was in a child welfare agency doing predominantly foster care work. And I wanted to train in each area to intensify my skills in each of those functional areas. So for 3 years after graduation, I went to work for the Brooklyn Bureau of Social Services and continued to do marital counseling, parent-child counseling, individual counseling. I then went to work for the Riverdale Children's Association in New York City. There I did predominantly foster care work. I was also hired to develop a different kind of service known as group home work for youngsters that couldn't survive in an institution, nor could they, or weren't necessary for them to be in an institution, and couldn't survive in foster care work. From Riverdale Children's Association, I went up to Montreal, where I became the director of the Jewish Child Welfare Bureau. And it was a multi-function agency doing the same kind of work that the other agencies are doing. In addition, they also did adoption work, worked with unmarried mothers, and any time a Jewish child was placed in an institution, we did the family work. I also developed a group home program when I was up in Montreal. From Montreal, I went down to Pennsylvania to become the clinical director of the Glen Middle Schools, which was an institution serving adjudicated delinquent youth in the state of Pennsylvania, mostly from Philadelphia. I think every gang in the city of Philadelphia was represented at the Glen Middle Schools. And I was there for 17 years. The other three agencies, I was there for 3 years. But here I remained, and from clinical director, I became program director, then assistant superintendent and superintendent for the last 8 years of those 17 years. From there, I went up to the Children's Center in Hamden, Connecticut, to become director of that center. That was also a multifunctional agency. It had an institution for emotionally disturbed, pre-delinquent boys and girls. It also had a foster care function, adoptions, work with unmarried mothers. We developed a shelter program, and we also developed a teenage parent program. From Riverdale Children's Association, from Children's Center, I should say, my brother was the the executive director of the Berkshire Farm Center and Services for Youth in Canaan, New York. And he passed away in January, my oldest brother, passed away in January of '77. And for 8 months, the board of directors, I guess, struggled to determine who might be the person to replace him. I had no intention at that time of leaving Connecticut. I was very happy with what I was doing down there. And I found it difficult even to think in terms of replacing my brother. But 8 months later, I was contacted by the president of the board of directors saying that they had been in touch with the the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, as well as with the American Correctional Association, and asked them to submit 5 potential candidates for the position of executive director, and I happened to be on both lists, and asked me at that time if I'd be interested. And by that time, I guess I'd adjusted to my brother's passing and felt it would be great if I could continue his fine work at that particular agency. So I allowed myself to become a candidate and eventually was hired and remained at Berkshire Farm Center and Services for Youth for 18 years.
And when did you retire, Harold?
I retired in March of 1995.
Now, although you retired, I know that you're still very active, and could you describe some of your activities now?
Be glad to. I was very, very fortunate. I loved my long career in social services, and I guess I was eager to find some way of maintaining a connection, and I was fortunate in being invited to function in other areas and remain connected. For example, I was invited by the director of the Child Welfare League of America, which was an umbrella advocacy group for some 1,300 agencies throughout the United States, to become a senior fellow and to do occasional consulting work and promotional work for the League. I remain today a senior fellow for the Child Welfare League of America. I have served as a past chairman and also serve as a member of the board and as chairman emeritus of the Northeast Parent-Child Society in Schenectady, New York. I'm a member and past chairman of the Berkshire Children and Families Incorporated, previously known as the Berkshire Center for Families and Children here in Berkshire County. I now serve as a member of the board of Hillcrest Educational Center, serve on its executive committee, I'm chairman of the nominating committee, serve on the clinical services committee, quality assurance committee, and on the development committee of Hillcrest Educational Center. I'm a member of the Citizens Advisory Board to the State Department of Social Services in Berkshire County. I'm past chairman and member of the board of the Jewish Federation of the Berkshires. I'm past chairman or president and member of the board of Knesset Israel Synagogue. And I'm also a member of the Lewis Green chapter of the Jewish War Veterans.
Amazing. Amazing career. Did you marry and have a family during all this time?
Yes, it's a very happy marriage for 46 years and to a wonderful woman, an art educator and an artist and a designer. Her name is Gladys Novick, and she was also a very prominent art educator. And so I was married to her for 46 years. Unfortunately, she passed away from breast cancer on July 12th, 2002. And I have a daughter who is a special education teacher. She lives in West Hartford and is a teacher at the elementary school in South Windsor. I have a son who is head of a science department and teaches biology at a private day school in Waltham, Massachusetts. He lives in Sharon, Massachusetts. And I have 3 wonderful grandchildren, a granddaughter, 2 years of age, a grandson who just celebrated his 6th year birthday, and another grandson who will celebrate his 9th birthday on July 22nd. And my daughter-in-law is also a history teacher at the same day school that my son is at.
Now, you told me a little interesting story about while you were in Montreal and your wife wasn't your wife then, but was still in New York, of communicating.
Oh, yeah. Well, I met my wife in 1954. She was a business manager of a recreational cooperative, which is another story unto itself. I left for Montreal in 1950. Well, 1954. I met her, I guess, in about 1953, and I left for Montreal in 1954. We thought that calling each other on the phone is kind of too costly since we maintain a relationship. So we decided eventually that the best way of communicating would be via tape. We were then able to cover a large territory, even though we weren't able to talk directly to each other. And we started sending tapes to each other until we decided that we shouldn't be, at least I decided that we shouldn't be separated and communicate that way. And I offered my hand in marriage in 1956.
Great story.
And we were married in the Bronx in 1956, and then lived in Montreal, where my daughter actually was born. She was born in September of, July 29th. In September, we left Montreal for Pennsylvania.
I see. Now, you mentioned belonging to the Lewis Green Post of the American Legion in Pittsfield.
That's correct.
Now, you also were instrumental in forming a post in the Bronx.
Yes, when I got out of service, during the service, I learned about the death of two very close friends of mine, named Bernard Markowitz and Joe Grossman. And I came out of the service.
They were killed in the war, Harold?
They were killed in the Pacific Theater of War. One was shot down, and the other one perished in Okinawa, trying to help somebody else. He was a first aid medical person. And I just wanted to do something in their names and continue to fight for the kinds of things I thought we were fighting against during World War II, and established a Jewish War Veterans Post in their names, and became known as the Grossman Markowitz Jewish War Veterans Post. And we're able to function in the area of advocacy against all kinds of all forms of discrimination that we experience both locally, statewide, or nationally.
Mm-hmm. You told me too that this close group of friends that you had were all together, including these two, on December 7th, 41?
Yeah, there was a small group of friends that we used to get together on Sundays, and whatever we might have been doing during the course of the week, we managed to get together socially, and we'd do a variety of things in terms of, there could be sports activity or picnicking or just plain socializing. And it was during one of those meetings on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, that word came over the air that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a very next day that I happened to be in the Great Hall of City College when President Roosevelt's famous speech was aired over the radio. And it was following, of course, that period of time during the course of the next year that I decided to enlist.
Now, we're coming to the end of our interview, Harold. I hate to see it coming there, but I have one last question. Do you think that your time in the service had a negative or a positive effect on the rest of your life?
I would say a positive. I mean, I can talk about all the negative experiences I had that's associated with war in general, and this war in particular, since it was a war not only against people in uniform, but it was a war against many, many citizens, particularly citizens of the Jewish faith, and those that fought against or didn't measure up to the racial standards of the Third Reich. Easy focus attention on that, but again, my practice really was not so much to live in the shadow of that kind of experience, but to use it, use that experience as a way of fighting against such things, to enter into a career or enter into activities that were designed to contradict the experiences I had in terms of the insensitivity on the part of certain people, the discriminatory nature, the cruelty that I experienced between people and towards people of certain faith and practices. And so in that sense, it served as a motivating force that led me to my career not only in social work, but my career in advocacy through various established organizations that I alluded to earlier. So I would say from that particular point of view, it had a positive effect, and primarily because I believed that I couldn't do anything about the past, but I could do something about the future.
Well, Harold, I want to thank you for coming here today and sharing your story with us. And I want to thank you for the service and sacrifices you gave for our country. And I want to give you credit for the continuing work you still do with your volunteerism. And I want to thank you, Harold.
You're quite welcome, and I appreciate the opportunity, as difficult as it might be to recall some of these experiences, but the opportunity to share these thoughts and feelings with you.
Well, thank you.